Hello everyone, welcome to Trauma Part 2, The Revenge. Trauma's pissed, it's coming to get you. Today we're going to look at the archetypes of Uranus with Cancer, Leo and Virgo. I thought I'd start by just adding something to our structural method and our rules from yesterday, which is, although we look at Uranus on a mental plane level as long-term memory, Jeffrey Green wrote a very interesting article in one of those old Llewellyn anthologies where he linked it to outer planets generally. And when we draw in Saturn by stressful aspect with Uranus, we add physical trauma, body trauma, past life death. When we draw in Pluto, we draw in psychological trauma, depth, compulsion, massive emotional trauma. And when we draw in Neptune, we draw in subtle trauma, disillusionment, states of meaninglessness and despair. So I just wanted to add that to the picture as a tool. It's a very interesting article worth digging out. It's called like Trauma and the Outer Planets, and it was in one of the Llewellyn series. Yeah.
It's also in Measuring the Night?
It's in Measuring the Night. Do you know which volume?
First.
It's in the first volume of Measuring the Night. It's reprinted.
Section of trauma.
It's under the trauma section. How handy and useful. Yes. Kimmery.
Mark, in the handouts, the Saturn part and the Saturn, Uranus, and Pluto parts are in the handouts, not the only one.
They're even in the handout. It's amazing stuff. Yeah. So it's there, and it's an approach we're going to want to add when we look at charts if we can today. All right, before we proceed further into trauma, we want to hold the idea that Uranus is not always about trauma. It's about liberation. And we look for trauma in order to liberate. And we can help the people whose charts we look at, and we can help ourselves by forming these identifications in order to encourage that liberation. In the spirit of that, I'll just ask that we kind of just have one quiet moment and we acknowledge really the great teachers of mankind, exemplified by the Buddha and the Christ, and the path of Dharma, or the path of salvation, the path of knowledge and enlightenment. Liberation takes place in that context. And to remember our long-term memory is to remember that potential. So we have the potential to walk in the paths that these beings have left for us. You cannot go wrong if you follow beings of the caliber of the Buddha and the Christ. And trauma becomes seen as a karmic trap, places in which, in the past and in the present, we have become imprisoned by certain causal momentum. So analyzing it accurately is in service of that liberation. The greatest liberation is the recognition of spiritual truth, that there is an undimmable light. As the Heart Sutra says, there is no aging, there is no death. But it also says there is no cessation of aging and death. Aging and death happen, but they do not exist ultimately. When we talk about trauma and karmic patterns, we are talking about samsaric binds. We are talking about the bondage of samsara. The Heart Sutra also says samsara is nirvana, nirvana is samsara. Now there is a mystical paradox, if ever there was one. The greatest pain, the greatest trauma can be the greatest liberation. The underlying truth is happening in the same realm that this is happening. It's totally about context. It's totally about understanding it in the moment, where you're coming from in it. So we are looking into these trauma patterns to assist in the liberation of these bonds that prevent that understanding. So we evoke, in a sense, the highest good. Deep within ourselves, we evoke the highest good, and we look to see these, to use this knowledge that we're trying to appropriate over the whole of this weekend, these kinds of skills, to look at a chart like this, to look at it as Sri Yukteswar told Yogananda in the Autobiography of a Yogi, that a man or a woman is born when the heavens are in complete mathematical harmony with their karma. This is a perfect learning ground. Everything in your life right now is a perfect chance to understand your karma and liberate it. Looking at the chart on that level, we have the intention of the highest good of the liberation of the person whose chart it is. We look at these example charts and the struggles people have had in that spirit. I thank these people who I've worked with and who've allowed me to use their charts from the bottom of my heart. And I have changed as a person through going through these experiences with these people. And you learn that the simple seam of things, the simple appearance is not enough. We go beyond Saturn ourselves if we can approach Uranus and trauma in the right spirit. So that's the intention. If you have the intention of the highest good of the person you're doing a reading for, then you can't go that far wrong. I would rather see an astrologer who's not very good at astrology, who has my highest good in mind, than I would see a brilliant astrologer who doesn't give a about me. So when you struggle and you're insecure about learning all these methods at the same time and everything we're going through here, don't freak out. The intention to approach the truth of your own being and another person's being through looking at the chart in this way is the most important aspect of it. This is not a breeding ground for technical astrology and how clever I am. In a talk called Towards an Astrology of Liberation at NORWAC this year, a keynote, I addressed the idea of the magician complex in the astrologer. You know, I will wave my magic wand, show you through my skills who you are, and therefore resolve everything for you. It's nonsense. It's a delusion fundamentally. It's a collaborative effort to the higher truth, the highest good of the potential of the being, the person you're with, or yourself, or your friend or family member or loved one whose chart you're looking at. This is the way to approach a chart, respectfully. You could almost liken it to going down on one knee before a certain, or like prostrating before a certain kind of altar or symbol of the Buddha or the Christ. You are literally approaching the soul dynamics of an individual. At the same time, we cannot be afraid to notice the pain where it is, because then the danger is we collude with the person's denial of that pain. People don't want to experience pain and suffering. And parts of their unconscious will want to meld with parts of your unconscious in the room if you're looking at their chart with them, so that it doesn't come out. So these trauma techniques are not to be used lightly, and they're to be used in a certain intention, but at the same time, don't be afraid. When we see, time and time again, I've seen these signatures and I've learned to become bold enough to say, and time again, it gets to the crux of something for that person. It is a disservice to be too mild-mannered about it. Any questions? Okay. Yes. Teresa.
Yes. What about, you talk about the Buddha and Christ,
Yes.
which, that's over here. But what about the Muslim people and the Islamic people and their, I mean,
Okay, sorry,
that's a
yeah.
whole-
In my just singling out of the Buddha and the Christ, I didn't mean to suggest that people who follow Muhammad or Krishna or indeed anyone else are not genuine people. I just simplify my examples of the great humans to the Buddha and the Christ for simplicity's sake. There's a long list of great humans. So please don't think I'm being exclusive in that regard. Okay. So there's Uranus in Cancer, the 4th house, or with the moon. To bring us up to speed on the collective level, by the way, just to catch us up, Uranus was in Aries from 1927 to the summer of 1934. It transferred to Taurus 1934 to 1942, Gemini 42 to 49, and it shifts into Cancer in 1949 to 55, 56. There's all sorts of ruminations we could say about the collective, and if it interests you, we can do it in some questions or in the break, but in the essence of the post-war scenario, the Uranus and Cancer generation have this issue about traditional gender roles. Now, Patricia was talking yesterday about Mars and Venus as dynamic of animus and anima. In traditional psychological astrology, that's the way it plays out. In evolutionary astrology, Jeff always asserted that Cancer is the sign of anima and animus. It's a double sign, the dual nature, the light side, the dark side of the moon, if you like. The anima being the hidden woman inside a man, the animus being the hidden man inside a woman. Uranus in Cancer is a trauma, if you like, in potential about traditional gender roles. It is also a sign in potential, when we look for these stressful aspects again, that there is significant damage to the inner child and the emotional body. Significant long-term damage. This is nearly always significant in a reading. This is nearly always a central part of significance in a reading. When you see Uranus with the moon, Uranus in Cancer generation, Uranus in the 4th house. In this generation, between 1953 and 56, Uranus was square Neptune, and for part of that was square Saturn-Neptune. I spoke of this in a talk in Sedona in 2005 called In Search of a Homeland. I think Kim has laid out copies of other talks I've given at evolutionary astrology conferences. In that, I asserted many of these people were forcibly taken from their families in past lives. Saturn, Neptune, square to Uranus, Cancer. Many of these people were taken by Greco-Roman cultures who built their cities on slavery, particularly from North Africa and other places in Europe. There are actual memories for a lot of these people about being forcibly taken from their home and their family. Neptune being an indication potentially of slavery because of the massive disempowerment within it, the sacrificial disempowerment. Saturn being an aggressive culture, an actual physical act. People came in and physically took you. It's a literalism of the trauma.
What's those planetary setup again?
That planetary setup again is 1953 to 56, Uranus square Neptune. Uranus in Cancer square Neptune in Libra. And Neptune was joined by Saturn for a good part of that. So there's a whole bunch of people born just after the aftermath of the war has settled down. Yeah? As people are being displaced all across Europe, and they are born with echo memories of prior displacements. When I see Uranus in Cancer, or Uranus in difficult aspect in the 4th house or the moon, I'm interested to what extent has this person's family experience repeated the trauma? To what extent do they feel fractured inside? The moon in evolutionary astrology corresponds to the ego, the nature of the personal self as it is grown through conditioning in the early family home of this life. So the south node of the moon is the prior life egos. The moon is the ego, the way we have come through childhood, the specific personal story. Pluto is the depth, unconscious attachment that underlies that. You can simplify and say soul and ego. It's a slight simplification, but it does help to visualize the different levels we're talking about. So someone has potentially, if there's a trauma signature applying to the moon, Cancer, or the 4th house, damage to the ego development, or serious hurt, abandonment, emotional fracturing to the inner child or the emotional body in potential. And this is going to apply to quite a number of people. This is not a rare signature. An entire generation were born under certain influences of it. Any questions?
A lot of these children were parented by the Pluto in Cancer
Yes.
generation.
Yes.
Does that magnify the potential for the trauma?
So the question is, the Pluto in Cancer generation parented a lot of this generation we're talking about. Does that magnify it? Yes. Because they control those gender roles, don't they? And they are... The Pluto in Cancer generation were instrumental in the issues as well about security that underlay the conflicts in the middle of the 20th century. Wars start on an inner level before they exist in the world. They start with the projection of hatred. They start with the disempowerment on some level that leads to the fantasy of aggression or expansion, and then the projection of hatred onto another. They exist in a dream place. They exist in a bardo before they exist physically. You see, the Pluto in Cancer generation had experiences that were dominated by their experience in, the middle part of the 20th century was one of the most intense periods of history, and we reached an extreme in mankind, didn't we? With the Holocaust and with atomic devices, we reached some kind of point of such significance that even now we haven't fully grasped it. Interestingly, both those events come from the Uranus and Taurus period into the Uranus and Gemini period. The Holocaust and the atomic event all come once Uranus has gone from Taurus into Gemini. The technological revolution, but also by this point, the Jewish problem as the Nazis saw it was purely a figures problem. After the survival traumas of the Uranus and Taurus generation, you're looking at people who had evolved it so it was just a numbers game. Uranus and Gemini, objectification of others. Objectification through the mind. The Pluto in Gemini generation that parented sometimes the Pluto in Cancer were involved in their upbringing, seeing people as objects at times, not realizing the emotional dynamics. So the Pluto in Cancer generation come in with unresolved emotional dynamics that weren't understood. And they're caught in that compulsion. And then the Pluto in Leo generation come along, baby booming past that with selfishness and creativity and what about me? How does it play out? Any questions? Yeah.
And also, it is the first global war. We've got men from America going to China and Burma or
Yes.
Germany, and they are temporarily displaced. Those gentlemen were
The
temporarily...
war itself displaces people on a scale we can barely imagine. And the level of trauma is still not digested, and some parts of the actual land still carry these traumas. The point's being made by Oriel that it was the first truly global conflict. Yes?
Did you talk about Uranus and difficult aspects to the axis of the chart also being a trauma signature, or is it just the planets?
The ascendant descendant, you mean, or midheaven IC? Yeah. I think that's worth noting. I think that is worth considering, yes. Yeah.
When you're talking about, you are talking about the aspect as well, right? So Uranus in aspect.
Yes.
Hard aspect to anything.
Hard aspect, yes. Obviously, look, we need. I'll try and show you in the couple of examples today. I'll try and show you the difference between when it plays out subtly with gentler aspects and when we've got like overwhelm and the real massive difference that's indicated. I don't want to become overly predictive. Just because you see massive overwhelm in aspects doesn't mean this person's life's just ruined. But, you know, it does tend to correlate with a hell of a lot having gone on. But yeah, in the displacement to the collective, in things like, you know, 20 million Russians killed on the Eastern Front, or what happens in Berlin after the war, or in North Africa, or Asia, it's vast. People end up after the war in places they never knew. They don't find family till decades later, even though the family survived. In the rare cases that the family survived. It's an intense sort of epitome of human behavior, in a way. So, Uranus in Cancer, 4th house moon. We want to look. Why do we want to look? Well, let's decide if we want to look. I mean, right now, maybe you don't read charts for people. Maybe you do. Maybe you're thinking about it. Maybe I'm going to help that. Maybe I'm going to put you off. I'm sorry about that. You've got to ask yourself, if you want to go for the Uranus in Cancer moon trauma signature, and you want to make that part of your work, or even check it out, what I'm saying to you, then you've got to be prepared to deal with, to look in the face of, to be with the damage in that person. If, frankly, excuse my language for the tape, if you're too pussy for that, don't do it. And it's not a machismo thing, it's just you've got to not be afraid of that damage in yourself. That's all you have to do to be with someone. I have damage. I have moon square Uranus. I have damage on that level. But I'm not, actually, I am afraid of that damage much of the time, but I'm not so afraid that I can't be with people about it. That's the only difference. The difference between therapeutic awareness and non-awareness is just simply that. You don't have to have resolved the issue. You just have to be not totally hiding from it. So we ask ourselves, when we look at charts on that level, what we want to do. There are all sorts of ways of reading charts. There's all sorts of ways of affirming a person's identity and being. This may not be our thing. The chart I'm going to show you as an example, as a really intense example of Uranus in the 4th house in a moment, was somebody I saw as a therapist. They did not come for an astrology reading. And in fact, they had already gone through psychiatric services before they came to me. So we're already in a certain playing field. And it's not like we always have to be in that playing field. But it's worth considering how we feel about what we're going to bring up or what we're going to look at when we look at a chart. It's worth asking ourselves inside what we're up for. Cool. Example, folks? Any more questions? Should we look at a chart? Cool. Is there one already up there? Yep. Oh, that'll be the chart then. Who feels brave enough to come here and come up, grab this, and show us some of the trauma signatures? Does anyone feel brave enough to do that? Yeah? Do you want to go for it? Take the mic and do it.
Oh. Well, Uranus in the 4th house, and it's, let me look. Well, first, Uranus in the 4th house, which you just were talking about, conjunct Pluto.
Yes.
So obviously soul, work and trauma. I'm just looking at the aspects here. Is that, well, it's not square in the moon, but it's doing, is that an inconjunct? No, it's semi-square to the Saturn.
Okay, so the central one, let's understand the central one. Pluto conjunct Uranus in the 4th house. If we just...
Soul trauma.
Yeah. The moon conjunct Neptune, yes, but what's the aspect? Yes, it squares the nodes, but what's the aspect that makes it a trauma signature? The moon and the Neptune. It does square the nodes, it's a skipped step, but technically for a trauma signature we want a stressful aspect to Uranus, Aquarius, or a planet in the 11th house. Saturn. The Saturn opposition from the 11th house draws in the moon Neptune.
The ruler of the south node is conjunct Pluto and Uranus.
Yes, Mercury, the ruler of the south node, is part of the trauma signature, with Pluto and Uranus. It's also retrograde. Mars is on the south node. I guess the picture is emerging, is it not? What would we rate this chart on the stress level, trauma-wise? What are we going to give it out of 10, do you think? It's pretty high, isn't it? The great majority of this chart is being drawn into a trauma signature.
And the ruler of the moon is the ascendant, Cancer's on the ascendant, and most of the energy is internal. It's right down deep at the,
Yes.
So there's some deep psychological angst that may not even be available to the person unless they really dig deep.
Deep psychological angst. Pluto, Uranus, Mercury, ruler of the south node, retrograde in the 4th house. Moon is a skip step. Moon with Neptune opposite Saturn in the 11th, the trauma signature. Everything moon-related, 4th house-related, is under this assault. Yes? So, go on, Linda. Ask again. It's Linda at the back.
Did this client have a pathological mental health problem?
Yes. Does this client have a pathological mental health problem? Yes, they do. They did, they do. Well, I very much hope it's gone, but... So a great question. So we're looking at a kind of stress on an ego developmental level that is so serious. Now, okay, before we look at this chart in deeper analysis, let's just have a brief aside on mental health issues. Mental health was perceived, and there is still a large movement to perceive it as a biological imbalance that essentially dooms people to a life of a certain kind. Now, there are people in the world, there may well be people in the world with serious biological imbalances. Certainly there are serial killers out there, and people that hurt children, you can lock them up for nearly forever. They come out, they just want to do it again. Some people just need to be kept away from healthy society. But at the same time, this biological fantasy is part of this Saturn reductionism I've been talking about in the world. This intention to make everything literal, to literalize the experience of being alive. It's also being understood by some more progressive psychiatrists and psychologists that trauma plays a role in the onset of mental health problems. It is not just some genetic biochemical thing. They used to talk about endogenous depression, a depression that you're just somehow born with. You were unlucky genetically, you're going to be depressed forever. Have some medication. And they contrasted that with like reactive depression. Someone died, you lost your job. There's a similar movement in the mental health world to categorize things in a certain way. Now, there's a lot of good people working in that sector. I'm not trying to knock them in any way. But it's interesting from our point of view that people are beginning to increasingly recognize the role of trauma in the onset of mental health problems. We can see here there is profound past life trauma, and we're going to make the assertion, I'm going to make the assertion, and this is one of the main points I want to make in all my series of talks, which I somehow failed to completely mention yesterday, which is past life dynamics play out through early childhood transference and experience. This is what I have, it was initially tentative, increasingly courageous sort of sentiment or understanding that I've reached as an evolutionary astrologer and therapist. projected childhood states and feelings, childhood early experiences, the way the child feels about the parents, the way they feel about the family experience, contains prior life traces. It contains the seeds of prior life experiences. It explains fundamentally why 4 children, 1 child experiences parent in one way, 2 children experience parent in another way. We are seeding in the garden of our childhood past life seeds, and they grow up, and we stare at certain plants as opposed to other ones, and we form interpretations as a result. Now, when we look at a chart like this, if we start with Pluto, Pluto in the 4th house can indicate a situation where one or both of the parents has fundamentally misunderstood the child or been unavailable to them. Can indicate that situation. The intention on an evolutionary level, on an underlying level, is to develop an emotional self-image and sense of security from within. Because in some ways that's not operated in the past. That's not been available to the person. The parent who fails the child enforces the evolutionary lesson in that sense. The intention to develop a consistent emotional self-image, regardless of parents, lover, friends, job. Pluto in Virgo can correspond to an internal crisis, being born into the life potentially in crisis. This is certainly true of the Pluto-Uranus generation. It's a trauma signature, and there is a mental crisis at the heart of it. An internal search for self-worth, an attempt to deal with like a hole inside, and the people are in a kind of crisis of analysis about that hole. They're trying to work out what the hell caused this, what's happened. Because of this tendency to extreme mental self-analysis, they're also very, very prone to the words and criticisms of others. There will be a tendency to have internalized messages from other people, potentially very hurtful messages. We see also it's with Mercury retrograde, ruler of the South Node in Virgo. This person has a Virgo trauma signature the size of a battleship lying across their 4th house harbor. Yeah, it's a random metaphor, but yeah. This person has a trauma signature the size of a large battleship lying across their 4th house harbor. You know, it's unmistakable, it's undeniable, and it's at that fundamental stage of development, the 4th house, early childhood, ego formation. That's where the analysis, when Linda said about pathological mental health issue, this is the seed of it. In the ego development, at the early stage of development, the messages come in. Frequently people receive the message with the Virgo dilemma, the Virgo in trauma, and really we kind of come to this in the 6th house trauma signature, but it's relevant obviously here, that they are in some way worthless. Here it all pertains to a 2nd house issue. Mars on the 2nd house, the desire nature. This person was aware that they were homosexual when they were about 10 years old. And the Christian family in which they belonged were not okay with that. In fact, in a one-on-one conversation with his grandfather when he was a small boy, his grandfather informed him in all seriousness that he was evil. He had, of course, not been discreet about this insight. Whether that becomes another tortuous example of self-defeating blame and guilt, but he had shared, Moon Sag, isn't it? Pretty kind of bright and bubbly person on one level. They had shared how they felt about themselves, and they had received the message that they were evil as a result. Second house, Venus, is to do with the unconditioned self, the way we relate to our deepest needs. And here we see a conditioning overlay, a message on that. The way I relate to myself on a depth level is fundamentally not okay. It's not just not okay, it's fundamentally not okay. You know, it's not just fundamentally not okay, it's the kind of thing that might see me, you know, spend places in eternity that aren't really good for me. And we can see that this person is the kind of person that's going to take this in. South Node Virgo, the ruler Mercury with Pluto, Uranus in the 4th, and it's retrograde. They have already heard this message before, multiple times. The intention is to come here again, play it out, and try to come through it. Try to make decisions about it. Yes, Janet?
Where is the resolution point in this chart?
Where is the resolution point in this chart, I'm being asked? Well, there is one at 26 degrees Pisces, sort of on the midheaven. And there is 2 degrees Pisces in the 8th house. The resolution points of this chart are the Pluto polarity point, opposite Pluto, and the North Node. Oh, you mean to the skip step? Oh, just for the skip step. Yeah, sorry. The skip step is going back to the South Node, exactly. It's part of the trauma. The Saturn opposition skip step is going to the North Node. The Moon and Neptune skip steps are going back to the South Node. He had this family experience, Moon, again, in order to, Neptune, heal, understand the betrayal, understand the sense of profound disillusionment and despair it engendered. But the risk when it's an 11 out of 10, as someone over here said, trauma chart, is that that's too overwhelming. It's too much too soon. Hence the fracturing that leads to the potential for the onset of a mental illness, or what we perceive to be one. So yeah, there are 2 skip steps. One's resolving via the South Node, the Moon, Neptune, and the other through the North Node. Even though it's out of sign, it's still within 10 degrees.
Well, how does this then correlate with what you said earlier about when you're born, your chart is in mathematical harmony with your intention, evolutionary intention.
Yeah, your karma. Yeah.
Being played out.
Yeah.
If the trauma is too deep for you to get through, for one to get through.
Well, and this person is still alive. I mean, we're coming to the levels of a question: why do people kill themselves? Why is there suffering in the world? I mean, these are very deep questions. I don't pretend to have every answer, but karma is like a universal law, isn't it? It's a perfect expression of response to every thought, feeling, action, and desire that you ever had. How you then respond to how that plays out is part of your evolutionary journey. And the freedom of that, and therefore the risk of that, can never be taken away from you.
Are you looking at the 10 degree, well, close to 11 degree for Saturn skip step in the same way that you'd look as the Moon, which is only 3 degrees from the skip step?
It's a good question. So the Saturn skip step is like 10, 11 degrees. The Moon is much less. Obviously, the closer skip step is the more intense one. But the Saturn still plays out as the judgment aspect, doesn't it? Aspects to the evolutionary axis, like Pluto-Uranus conjunctions or skipped steps, I will look at 12-degree orbs as a kind of, I'm just fine with that. And I might even consider between 12 and 15-degree orb, which interestingly corresponds with Richard Tarnas's work researching cultural movements and historical movements with major transit activity of outer planets, where he finds that 15-degree orbs of those movements kind of bookmark that period. When we look at evolutionary astrology, we're looking at the larger historical context of the evolution of that soul. And these large orbs tend to work across the evolutionary axis. Obviously, you're not looking at a Mercury sextile Mars with a 10-degree orb or anything, you know? Just major Ptolemaic aspects to the nodal axis and from Pluto.
I just wanted to comment to that previous question,
Yeah.
is that what you said at the beginning, if you're willing to look at a person's chart, you know, you're willing to touch on the trauma and what I was thinking is that if you look at a difficult chart, you know that there's some medicine, there is some healing in the chart, because God, Goddess gives us the difficult, but He'll also give us the opportunity to evolve. And so in this chart, like, there is a trauma signature, but at the same time, Saturn is trining, you know, the Mercury and the Sun. Like, there's going to be an opportunity to become our own inner authority and become strong inside. And as we heal, you know.
Well, and we come into a question of faith, don't we? And this I come into, in work like this, I come across that. I mean, I have thought in a Pluto, particularly Pluto and Virgo masochistic moment, of doing an entire workshop on the clients I failed, you know, or, you know, we didn't get very far, you know, last degree Pluto and Virgo, yeah, and I come up with that idea.
Every chart has some resolution.
Yes, and this, you know, the faith in this work that, so, this person's seen a psychiatrist, they've also seen another therapist who fell asleep on them because they were on pain-killing medication for putting their back out. So they're in some, like, kind of fairly difficult trust places about the whole process. And they are privately coming to see me, because I'm not a clinical psychologist or a psychiatrist. It's another situation, isn't it? The number of people I can't tell you I've worked with their North Node, this generation, or people in the next generation, North Node 2-3 degrees Pisces, my son. And his Jupiter is on my midheaven. The number of people who have felt capable of talking to me about what they couldn't talk about before, that have that signature where their North Node touches my sun, my core energy. They just respond to me in a certain way in the room. What the situation when you have somebody who's seeing a psychiatrist managed by a community psychiatric nurse, is the system in the UK, and is on medication, is that you set more limited goals, in a sense. Why is he there? Why is he seeing me? I've got no capacity to change his medication or form any ultimate. Well, when he is a teenager and he's taking drugs and he's trying to escape the family home, he spends a lot of time with a disabled man who became disabled later in life and is embittered by it. And this man dabbles in magic. You kind of Crowley-esque type place. Something that from earlier in my life I had a reasonable degree of awareness of. And this young man who has internalized so many negative messages is convinced that this person demonized him or did some form of negative act of magic which has contributed to his bipolar disorder. He is convinced that he has met someone in this life and they have, through some act of drug-induced magic, planted some negative or evil spirit upon him. Without me ever fully consciously really setting this as the goal of therapy, it sort of evolved as the goal of therapy to explore and see what we could do with that. And we got there. My sun, the North Node, the trine Jupiter to my midheaven, we got there. He realized as we analyzed it that this bitter old man messed about with stuff, but he didn't have the power to do that. That's how I convinced him, on an analysis of the magic that this man knew, that he was basically cruddy, but nasty guy, but too weak to ever really do that. And this guy was over the moon. And for weeks and months there was an improvement. And then he was so happy, there was a massive manic inflation. And he came in one day and just said, I don't need this anymore, and he was off. And then sadly, a year later, I was run by a clinic, and he rang me from a clinic in London where he'd been sectioned, forcibly sectioned, and he was insisting that I speak to his psychiatrist and tell them that he wasn't mad. No, I did not. I couldn't, in all integrity, could I? Because I had no idea. But on the faith front, it was genuinely liberating for this young man that this specific experience that had obsessed him in this life was reframed. Whatever goes on to play out, I have no idea. This was a long time ago. Good luck to him.
I have a question about the Mars conjunct the South Node in this configuration. So, some idea that he was also violently part of his judgment and his internalization of this, all this other energy was acted out violently in another life as well, probably.
Yes, and there's a rage, isn't there? But there's also an intention in a way to create crisis. Mars in Virgo, in a signature like this, a stressful signature, is often literally an intention to create crisis in relationship, to expose the underlying dynamics. Yes, the person, this is the transition from Leo to Virgo, and we're going to talk about this today. We're moving ahead of ourselves slightly. But in Leo, you reach this fulcrum of the development of the self. And in Virgo, you attempt to invert it. So that when you come to Libra, you can meet other people as equals. Here we see the Mars and Virgo crisis is that selfish, sexual acting out and anger in the past has led this person to the point where they want to analyze that in a different way. And this, as frequently happens in Virgo trauma signatures, the sincere desire to analyze oneself in a different way becomes so inverted the other way, so masochistic, that intensely negative messages start to take over. And then it becomes its own cycle. It creates a life of its own. The number of good people, I will say it, I've said it before in talks, I'll say it again, the stunning number of good, kind people who feel terribly about themselves in day-to-day life, that they're terrible, bad people, is just unbelievable. The amount of people I meet and work with like that. The bad days when I feel like that myself. It's just amazing. And it's a lot of this from Virgo is comparing oneself to a perfect standard. Somewhere deep down, subliminally, there is a constant comparison with a perfect standard of behavior, an ideal. So we'll come to that with Uranus and Virgo. But I have experienced many people, and there'll be others in these examples, that help is either limited or very, very difficult, or stuckness prevails. But I still say, being with someone with the right intention is a reward, is an end in itself. And even if that person comes and just owns their stuckness with you, you could argue that is valuable in and of itself. Any questions?
Do you ever see Uranus transits over planets or angles cause trauma/liberation, even if that planet natally isn't traumatized?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that's a really good question. Uranus transits can trigger liberation as they can trigger trauma. Yes, absolutely. As can major outer planet transits to a not very stressed natal Uranus. You know, or, well, obviously a very stressed one too, but I mean, these become looking on a timing level, and maybe we can talk about this in one of the latter talks, looking on a timing level for the big movements in a person's chart, the 3, 4, 5 kind of times they're going to have in a lifetime when certain things happen. See, I'm not one of these people, I don't know where my secondary progressed moon is right now. And what I learned about tertiary progressions, I forgot so long ago. I'm not even sure what they are anymore. And I'm not very good at planning when you should start a business or what would be a good day to do so-and-so. But I'm good at cutting to the chase of the handful of major transitions in a person's lifetime. The times that when you see it and they've come for a reading, you suddenly realize you've got to step it up. You've got to step up to the plate. And the person has a chance. They have an opportunity right in front of you. This living, breathing soul has an opportunity right in front of you to do something major. And I salute those people, and I, try my best in those moments to rise to the occasion if I can. It's not about trying to amp the pressure just to see the significance. Any questions?
I'd like to ask you what you think about the Chiron. I know you mentioned something about not using Chiron, but it's opposing Uranus.
We're talking about Chiron now. As someone, was it you, pointed out yesterday, because of the elliptical orbit of Chiron, it has a very long-standing opposition to Uranus. I just don't... Yeah, it's not my personal thing. I very much like the Barbara Han Cloud book on Chiron.
Yeah, what she has to say about it.
I think is important in this particular chart. That's
Yes.
what just...
Well, and I think if you're going to use Chiron, then of course the whole idea of the wounded healer becomes a very important thing, doesn't it? It is, of course. It has a relevance to the wound, doesn't it? It's a useful thing to bring up. I guess I don't use it in just cleanly trying to identify trauma signatures, but if I start to see it, I will look at it.
She says that it is associated with that Virgo sign.
Yeah, I don't actually go with that, but I like the rest of it.
I like to think of it that way because from Saturn we move toward Uranus, and Chiron being, you know.
Okay, well, I mean, maybe we can talk about that in the break as well, because there is a subtle argument there, and she makes it very convincingly. She does.
About the retrogradation in the chart.
The retrogradation in the chart here is about the intention to repeat. Mercury retrograde in a chart like this is about not that the desire and intention is not to generate new experience. It's to understand what has already been learned and to digest it. And it's a conscious intention as the ruler of the South Node here, or it's an intention of the karma of the situation that this person hear things they had heard before early in life. And then it's about the digestion of that process. It explains a lot of people who have Mercury retrograde yet do not do well at certain aspects of school. Not all, but some. And it's very good at explaining sometimes why. It can be a lot of relief for people to realize that actually they're digesting what they already know at this point, rather than having to go out and expand in that way.
So, Mark, at the beginning, when you started, you were talking about Uranus and Cancer, and you gave us a description of early childhood trauma, being misunderstood by the parent, developing an emotional security. So that's all applies to this chart, exactly. That's exactly, So what is his, so he has all those signatures. He was born with them. What is the resolution for this? Is there, what's his resolution?
The resolution, long term, you see, the fragmentation has been so intense in past lives that it propels him into this experience, North Node, Pisces, 10th. North Node Pisces, Pluto polarity point Pisces 10th, The intention is forgiveness, healing, depth understanding, to surrender the agitation about it, because there is anger. Mars on the South Node. There's anger about what these people have said. There's anger about his own desire nature. And he's in denial of it. Virgo, South Node. Virgo signature massively in the 4th house. This person's in denial of it. His tendency was mania. His bipolar disorder was definitely, the seesaw was weighted towards mania. He struggled with depression in the sense that he denied that it was even there on one level. He would go into manic flights. So the intention, in a way, part of the intention, North Node Pisces 8th, and he finds a therapist with his son there, is to confess, is to tell, and therefore begin the potential for healing, to listen and surrender the messages. These messages aren't fundamentally real. He's not fundamentally an evil person because he likes men,
So the pathology is so intense that the most you can offer him is some soul healing. But really, that's about as far as it goes, because he's going to have to work it through.
People will have different views on this. I mean, some psychiatrists had this guy on medication for a long time. This person's neuroleptic or antipsychiatric medication was so intense that the shape of their head had changed. They had like a slightly ballooned size head, because many of these antipsychotic medications are so strong that they actually affect people's appearance pronouncedly. Massively exaggerated weight gain, but in a specific type of way. You know, it's not where the body would normally put on the weight, in a sense. So he had a slightly enlarged head. That's the level of the medication path. I mean, there's a whole discussion on the ins and outs of that path. But once you know a person's on that kind of medication and are consulting a psychiatrist routinely, yes, I mean, beautiful that the whole get on the mat, like Patricia says, thing is, yeah? It would not be appropriate here. If anything, it was all about me allowing him to reach the conclusions about the power he felt this embittered man had over him in some sort of magical thrall. It was all about me not telling him that this guy wasn't empowered enough to do that to him, but helping him have the space to realize that himself. Because everything else is imposed on him, and the danger would be, as a therapist or a psychiatrist, is that you're dragged to imposing on him. And via countertransference, some of this man's psychiatrists were, in a sense, imposing a punishing regime. Just like these prior life families and prior life Christian situations of a certain kind that he was in did for him. So the danger of helping in certain contexts is that you simply re-traumatize or you enact the pathology.
It seems like music would be some good therapy for him.
He loved going dancing.
Yeah.
It's almost like you have to validate his reality and help him to move forward in that, as opposed to, telling him.
Yes.
Because if you tell him that he's wrong in believing that,
I know.
He's not gonna.
He just hears the wrong then, potentially,
Yeah,
doesn't he? Rather than the... And this is maybe, and what's being outlined here, so what's your name? What Deirdre's outlining is the ultimate therapeutic dilemma as far as I'm concerned, or maybe it's just the one that I'm on the edge of right now in my work. Love, empathy, unconditional positive regard, and yet challenge. Some of this being that you have love and empathy for, some of their beliefs, some of their behaviors, some of their life expression is destroying them. You want to stand up against that. If you stand up against that and you get it right, it could change their life. If you stand up against that and it's not the right time, then you lose potentially the love bridge, the empathy, the rapport, the unconditional regard. That's my edge right now. And I have really helped some people recently by surfing that edge, and I've lost a couple of people. Yeah.
I think it's always better to go with the path of non-resistance. So standing up against, as opposed to just embracing their reality and being there with them and experiencing that, is totally the way to go, I think, especially with someone like this.
Of course, and that's how I was with this person. Of course, he then just decided to end when he was in a good mood about that. If you don't side with the part of the person they can't own, they will hide that part from you. But if you never have the balls to stand up and show them what that part's doing to them, down the line, you potentially fail them also. Very, very difficult decisions. Linda?
So, in situations like that, where you're right at the edge, you got a one-shot deal on this person, you get the hit, you should go for it. Do you always go for it? Or how do you decide?
Yeah, I mean, this is very, very tough. I don't have an easy answer. Sometimes I go... When I started out, I was far too nice, and I secretly held a salvation fantasy that my loving, soft nature would help people tremendously. And I got burned. Then as I got more confident and became more empowered, I took that risk to stand up alongside people and point out what was most negative about them. And, it was a real advancement. It was a real empowerment. And I still got burned. And I'll adjust that, and I'll move on. And you know what? I'll still get burned. And the thing is, sometimes, whatever I do, I'll get burned. There's no right answer in that sense. There's no way of avoiding that. As we come to the break, we face the sobering reality. There's only so much you're ever going to be able to do in certain situations. But I guess it's all about, or it becomes about, the way you offer it and the kind of unique relationship you have with that person each time. So we'll just have a brief 5-minute maybe a bit longer, just a coffee, restroom and stuff. Thanks, everyone. Oh, sorry, Ken.
Let me speak. I forgot something. I had sent out an email to everybody about whether or not people would be interested in having some hors d'oeuvres tomorrow night. For like
Uranus in Leo, 5th house, Sun. Trauma about not being acknowledged as special, as creative, as important. Trauma from a failure for acknowledgement.
Uranus in Leo?
Uranus in Leo, 5th house with the Sun. In some cases, memories of royalty, aristocracy, and a sense of why isn't it like that now? It is tough, isn't it? Why don't we have servants sometimes? I mean,
Where's the help?
you know, I'm a South Node Leo, but a Pluto and Virgo. You know, part of me thinks we should all just be incredibly equal and following, you know, the great teachings. You know, there's a lot of bullshit in this world, people with far too much money and all that. But every now and then, I do like it when people do things for me and treat me as special. There was a time when I was coming here doing the conferences where Continental made me Silver Elite for a while, and I got to jump the queues and come on the plane. And it did just give me a little, you know, lift in my step, you know. I was a little bit out of the ordinary. It hasn't happened too much in this life, but hey, it was great. Great while it lasted, approximately 1 year, and about 2 flights. So yeah, I'm pitching fairly low on the Leo great stakes in this life. Yeah, sometimes traumatic memories. You know, why aren't people treating me in a certain way? But also a trauma around shock or sudden change or realization that one's life purpose, creative sense of destiny, one's sense of special destiny is different than you thought it was. Something happens to fundamentally change your perception of your life, your creative direction, what it means to self-actualize. And the suddenness of the reversal, the potential shock of that. I mean, Leo has that thing, doesn't it? I mean, how can, it's like everyone wants to be special. Everyone is special. But then if everyone's special, is that the kind of special I want, you know? You know, it's like Groucho Marx's great saying, you know? I don't want to be in that club if they'll have me as a member, you know? If everyone's special as special as it used to be? Special's on discount this week, you know? I'm not interested in that kind of special, yeah? But this issue with Leo, the central issue with Leo is this creative sense of special destiny. And this has tremendous potential in it. There has a good deal of truth in it. Just because there may be narcissistic distortions at the edges of it, just because there may be fantasies or subconscious desires for greatness, doesn't mean it's not true. Just means it needs to be handled or seen in a certain way. Some of these people get into the superhuman complex, you know? The guy we're about to see, the chart example that we're about to look at, fits this category. I don't know if we can see his chart. Yes, we can. This is a young man that came to see me the week after he had his second police chase on the same night in his car. He outran them the first time, but the second time they caught him. He was also drinking and high on cocaine at the time. And he thought when they ran out of coke, him and his buddies having a great night, that it would be a good idea to go back out and score again when they'd already seen the police once and outrun the police car once. If that's not just a hint of superhuman delusion. I mean, it's amazing. This guy must have been a pretty good driver. You don't outrun the police the first time very often. I mean, my first reaction to him was like, "Way, man, well done," in a way. You know, like, why didn't you acknowledge your gifts in that moment, you know, and have done with it? You did it once. Be proud, you know? Calm down. No, he was very, very foolish and very intense. Now, this is also someone who's extraordinarily creative. Extraordinarily creative. winner of a prestigious photography award in their 20s, photojournalist for like really prestigious. And they had a project, they had a commitment to a project which was part of why they won the award that had not been done, and it was stalling. And it was long-term stalling. And that's when he started partying with his friends.
What's that last word?
Stalling. It was on hold. It wasn't happening for him. His creative project is also at times an expression of his superhuman complex, which he sort of genuinely has too. This is really quite a vibrant, charismatic young man, extraordinarily sort of energized, can handle himself, very charismatic. And part of this project involves hanging out with gypsies in the UK and their pugilism, their hand-to-hand fighting as a form of settling family debates and chivalry questions. So he goes to fights and photographs and films and is in with the hardcore gypsy kings, if you like. Why is he in with them? Because one of them, who is renowned for having never lost a fight, went on his own to a rival gypsy tribe, walked in there on his own, mouthing off after previously having sort of beaten up their hero, and the entire tribe chased out at him with like weapons and stuff. And this guy, the photojournalist, having seen that this guy was going to do this, drove his car up, grabbed this guy, got him in the car and drove off with these people chasing after him. He's the guy following the story, yeah? Yeah? And the family respected what he did so much that he now has protection and is driven and is taken to every fight, and they want in, and he's decided to make a film out of it. Because he got inside, because they admired, because he went hare coursing with them, because he took his own car illegally off into fields chasing hares with their dogs, because at times he doesn't give a, and he has this superhuman complex, and what? They dig it, they appreciate it, they understand that he's prepared to take the risk. Yet he, at his best, channels it creatively. Since he has done these things with these people, there has been no acting out in his life. When this project was on hold, the acting out occurs in his life.
Sad signature,
yes.
Gypsy energy. Jupiter is in Scorpio, and it's squaring Venus in Aquarius.
Yes, another trauma signature, exactly.
So that's the only trauma, I mean, other
the
than...
The other trauma signature, and it's subtle, right, is Uranus sesquiquadrate the midheaven. When the career isn't channeling the Uranus fifth energy, he blows. Uranus 135 aspect to the Aries midheaven. Subtle. I only found that, not because I don't really look for sesquiquadrates very often because they're a bit mathematically difficult, aren't they? But I looked for it because I was so aware of this relationship between this energy and his career, and I thought there must be a signature. So I actually, added it all up in my head. I made an effort. I'm quite lazy when I look at charts sometimes, so that was kind of a big deal. It was for you guys, actually, so that I'd have something intelligent to say about it. It's amazing, isn't it? It's channeled. When he can't express it in the fifth, he channels it there. The Venus and Aquarius, the Jupiter Scorpio, is complex. It plays out in his personal life, which I'm not really going to talk about right now. But suffice it to say, one significant X meets people who are, again, famous or prestigious, but they're traumatized. Including, I believe, a very famous US reporter. But I don't know anything about that kind of thing. So, here, the interesting dynamic to me is the fourth house playing into the fifth. This person's name is the name of like an English king and another name that you could mean king by. So it's like king surname, yeah? His family background, we look at that fourth house and that culminating signature, Pluto, Saturn. His family background is that the mother's side is extraordinarily rich, relatively recent aristocracy in the UK. But the father's lineage is East End, Cockney hardman. The parents didn't last, but the legacy handed to my client was privileged upbringing, but all the time this identification with the absent father that plays out in hanging out with certain types of people who like to do certain types of things and proving yourself to those people as a way of subconsciously honoring your father. And that's what I said to him the first time I met him. And we clicked. And, a year later, his court case went very well. And a nice letter from his therapist helped ameliorate the sentence somewhat. But, you see, in doing it, he was pledging an allegiance. He was proving himself. It has a subconscious rationale from the 4th house, Pluto-Saturn, that plays out through the Uranus 5th, this feeling that comes upon him that he can almost do anything. And he hangs out with certain kinds of people. Venus Aquarius, the detachment necessary to hang out. A previous project was football hooligans. Hooligans, the kind of people like soccer hooligans that get together in gangs, wear very smart clothes, and then meet so they can beat each other up with sticks and get blood all over those smart clothes. And these guys loved him. He has this incredible capacity to be involved with any kind of person and just get on. The thing that interested me about this chart was the way the subconscious family dynamic, Pluto-Saturn, balsamic in the 4th, plays out through the superhuman trauma signature issue, Uranus in Sag, sesquiquadra at the midheaven. When the career is frustrated, he plays it out in his personal life. Because all that energy rises up in him and he doesn't know what to do with it. So the partying gets out of hand.
What about the skip steps of Saturn and Pluto to the nodes? Skip steps.
So asking about skip steps to the nodes, and this is essentially his perception and feeling about the family situation, isn't it? On one level playing out. Yeah? And also, if you like, an ego-soul dynamic. Whenever Pluto squares the nodes, there is the potential for an ego-soul conflict, a kind of real, fork in the road, choice on the path, Robert Johnson kind of moment. And here you see the past legacy of the power in the family, the Pluto-Saturn signature. But the family can never accept the father properly. So there's this guilt, there's this part taken out that he wants to subconsciously acknowledge. And he has this choice, this guy. He comes from this family of power, but he chooses to act in a certain way to undermine that power because he doesn't feel comfortable about the loss. And then the other danger is, and this is what we talk about a lot in a way, is when he is successful, because with someone like this, this is nearly guaranteed, as the level of creative energy is just super intense. And just some preliminary footage that he shot on his own digital camera for his photojournalism, the film footage he shot on that he's put together has already seen serious people interested, is how then he copes, because really this is someone who is coming to a place of emotional healing. They are wanting to resolve this 4th house combination through the North Node in Cancer and the 12th. That is about this person's genuine softness at times, this genuine capacity, this kind of care in them, which people pick up, that he's sufficiently detached, Venus in Aquarius, that he can play it out with people in a variety of different ways. The danger in that with the Uranus in the 5th house is the narcissistic wound, the break, especially if things go well for him. And this is a temptation that he's seen in the sphere of relationship. He's having it played out, particularly through people he knows in relationship. People who are very, very famous or creatively acknowledged, but destroyed inside. Yes?
Talk more about narcissistic moon.
So narcissistic wounding. This is on one level, this is something that happens to anyone, right? Narcissistic wounding in a general sense is whenever as a small child or as a young being, you were not mirrored, you were not acknowledged in your creativity or your joy or what you were bringing, your gift of your beingness, then it creates the potential for narcissistic wounding. In the generalized sense, narcissistic wounding is every time you were let down growing up. Every time the sheer joy and gift of your beingness was not acknowledged by others and you start to lose that sense. You're looking, when you're very young, the acknowledgement from the other points you back to yourself. And you lose that part of yourself because it's not acknowledged by another. But narcissistic wounding in a much more specific sense is an extension of that clinically, like narcissistic personality defense or disorder. Clinically, I mean, having knocked certain clinical issues earlier, I am still into them. This is a very complex discussion at some point. But narcissistic personality disorder is usually seen when envy, when the parent offers to the child, but the subconscious envy of the parent for what they lacked themselves is experienced like a subtle toxin the whole time by the child. And although they seem to be being given everything, inside they feel dirty or ashamed or even attacked by it. And it tends to lead to people who always show promise, and they're going to be amazing at everything, and they never do any of it. Because all the time, the space and creativity they were given was tainted by subconscious envy and destructive feelings of the parents. That's narcissistic personality disorder in a nutshell. But narcissistic wounding in the generalized sense is something we all have, to some extent or another. These are issues of the development of the self, particularly Leo, but through the 4th and the 5th house. The whole, you can look at Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, Leo as the development of the self. Aries at birth, the instinctual reality, you can cry, you can scream. Taurus, the capacity to start developing the internal values. Mummy is still there, and she still loves me even though she's not there for 10 minutes. You know, consistency, what psychologists call object constancy. You've internalized the object, the mother. Gemini, language skills, learning how to mimic. They say language centers develop because of touch on the brain and skull. When you see children have been brought up by feral animals, you know, children have been brought up by wolves or dogs, they don't develop language skills. Without certain type of mimicry and also certain types of touch, particularly in the skull area and the very early body of the infant, you don't actually develop language skills. These children just bark or whine. And then Cancer, the development of the ego, the development of a specific self from the early environment. And then in Leo, the 5th house, the creatively actualizing self, the sense of having a kind of independent self with purpose and direction in the world. So you can read those first 5 archetypes as the building of the personal self, which then at Virgo you invert. You turn it round. Because in its narcissistic guise, the build-up of the self won't meet the other in Libra as an equal. It will dominate. Small children. I have 2 nephews, my sister's nephew and my girlfriend's sister's boy. My sister's boy and my girlfriend's sister's boy. And they play together, and it's just intense, you know, the ego stuff. The no, it's my shot. No, you had 2 shots already, it's my shot now. They never pass to each other playing soccer. They just never pass. I mean, I don't know if you know about soccer, but I mean, you have to pass if it's going to work. They only want to score. It's about glory, and it's natural. At that stage, it's natural, but it's very hard for them to they have occasional moods where they're loving and giving enough to allow the other to have that moment, but it's rarer than you'd think. In Virgo, you invert that process so that you meet the other in Libra as an equal. The problem with Virgo is the spiraling downward spiral when that tipping over becomes excessively negative in a progressive way. Yes?
In this chart, then, is that accentuated by the Mars there?
I think the Mars placement, the trine to Venus, it's all part of his incredible capacity, yeah, and they're both sextile by the Uranus placement, you know. It's all part of this person's incredible capacity to blend and be with people. And it's incredible, and it's not an act. This is the other stunning thing. It's for real. He likes hanging out with just some really strange people, the kind of people that you might think is interesting in a talk like this, but you'd soon be scared within seconds of actually being in their company. The Virgo dilemma, the Leo dilemma, is the narcissistic delusion. Mick Jagger can go out with 20-somethings, so Mick Jagger thinks it's a good idea to go out with 20-somethings. Mick, it's not a good idea. You know? It's kind of tiresome. The Virgo consciousness has realized this quite sensibly, but then in reversing the polarity, tends to go too far. And tends to create a psychology of denial and frustration so that they don't achieve, it can become crippling so you don't achieve anything. The Leo person, the Leo consciousness in that sense, tends to think everything they do is great. So the bands like that tend to think their current albums are actually worth putting out, yeah? When they're obviously not, yeah? They stopped making anything good in like 1984 or something. But they believe in it, whereas you're going to have huge talented folks in the Pluto and Virgo generation that never put out album one because they never got to that point, because they can't get going. When you see it in trauma signatures, when you see the shift from Leo to Virgo in trauma signatures, you see the extreme distress caused by persecutory, alienating messages inside and the loss of center inside. Leo is like a burning sun at the center. Strong Leo consciousnesses know where they're coming from. It's solid. The Virgo consciousness at its core has a gap. The Pisces polarity is to fill the gap with spirit, with healing, with a forgiving understanding. Just like the Aquarian polarity with the Leo consciousness is to understand through detachment where your creativity applies and where it doesn't. Yeah.
I just saw it. There's an intercepted house here.
There's what?
Intercepted houses.
Yeah. I mean,
is that not also skip step?
Yeah. As it's outside of the realm of trauma, let's have that conversation if we can after this section. Let's try and do Virgo in our limited timescale, and we'll talk about that because it's complex and subtle, and I don't have an easy answer. Okay, any questions?
How long ago did you do this chart? Was it recently?
Yeah.
Because, you know, transiting Pluto has gone over his sun and then it's going to go back over his sun.
The court case was 3 weeks ago.
Really?
And
Well.
the driving incident was last fall.
So it's just with Pluto, Sun, Mercury. But it's so interesting because Pluto demands absolute honesty on a psychological level. I mean, you know, at least I see it that way, you know. So you would think there's going to be a shift because he sounds like there's some awareness.
Oh, there's loads here. There's been a massive shift. And this person has really been grateful and committed to working with me for a period of time because they have really creatively channeled the energy now.
Who's an EA.
Yeah, I mean, he didn't know that. He came oddly through.
But that things happen.
Yeah, well, a strange route, which is, yeah. But, yeah, it's remarkable the energy this person has liberated by truly committing to their creativity. It's just stunning.
And what degrees is your ascendant?
My ascendant, 26 Sag.
26 Sag.
But I've
so
got.
his Neptune's on your ascendant?
Yes, his Neptune's on, yeah.
Okay.
His Uranus is on my Neptune.
Okay.
And I do really appreciate what he's doing. It's amazing. So great. Let's... What? How should we break this up? How should we play it? Should we talk about Virgo? Do we want to look at an example of Virgo? What's going to energize us in this astro hothouse? Okay, I've got... How much time have we got, Leroy? 35. So I've got an example with Uranus in the 5th in Virgo, or I've got an example of Uranus in the 7th in Virgo, which would be a bridge for a longer example that we can go into in much more depth. And we can bridge it till tomorrow as well, because it's the 7th house as well. Do you want a quick look at the Uranus in Virgo in the 5th before we do that? Or should we just do then 5-10 minute, just a 5-minute breakdown of that, and then we'll do the longer example? Yeah? Because the longer example we can then carry to tomorrow and try and look at it more completely as an analysis. Sound cool? Wow. God, you guys are dedicated. Fair play. Yes.
Which is going to square his nodes. Saturn square the nodes, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's a way off, isn't it? It's certainly coming to his Mars at the moment, and that's the recognition of limitation that's occurred, isn't it? This person's going to have to do community service, you know? He's going to have to, he grew up in a very privileged background, and he's going to be like, cleaning the side of the road and what have you. Although he's already dreamed up a plan to offer his skills as a photojournalist and filmmaker to the community services, to do something on like knife crime in inner cities to show what they're doing, to see if he can get some of his hours reduced. So you've got to admire the vision, haven't you? I mean, really. You get community service. He was let off jail. Jail sentence was suspended partly because his therapist wrote a very nice letter, and partly because some prestigious head of a creative organization in the States wrote a career reference about how talented this guy was. So he called out the players as well, He's got that ability to administer resources. Okay, did I put the other chart up? Yeah. This is the brief example we're going to do so that we can do a more extensive example. So we can start a more extensive example today and carry it into tomorrow. Does someone want to just either shout out or come up here and identify some trauma signatures?
Well, the moon's squaring the nodes.
Sorry, what did you say?
Moon squares the nodes?
Yeah. But, okay, it does, and that is really going to be relevant to us, because what? That suggests some kind of issue with the family, unresolved issue with the family. But let's start with just avert trauma signatures. Where does Uranus make a stressful aspect? Yeah. Uranus-Pluto conjunction. Saturn in the 11th, opposite the Uranus-Pluto conjunction. And because Pluto is in the 11th, and it's 11 degrees, sorry, not in the 11th, 11 degrees, and it's dragged into the trauma signature by the proximity to Uranus, 11 degrees to the 14 degrees Gemini sun drags the sun into the trauma signature. Do you see what I've done? So we have a Pluto-Uranus trauma signature, opposite Saturn, and T squaring the sun. And then we have a moon skip step. Again, this is a fairly high-octane example of trauma. What kind of trauma might we fantasize or expect? Resources. There may be difficulty on that level. What trauma might we expect by Pluto, Uranus, Virgo, Uranus, Virgo in the 5th house, or opposite Saturn? An issue with authority, possible health issues, problem with the parents. I mean,
just a real existential void.
Yes, a real existential void. Very good. I like that. Why? Because we're not making this up. This is, we know that Virgo is an inversion from the Leo principle. Uranus in Virgo is a trauma about that inversion. We know this entire generation are born under a trauma signature. We know the tendency of the Virgo trauma is to go too far from the Leo strength. We see a Saturn opposition. It has involved physical trauma. Physical trauma. Uranus applying to Saturn in a stressful aspect. It's dragged in physical trauma. Saturn rules the south node in Capricorn. In the 9th, but very close to the midheaven. Guilt. Difficult experience. This can be a very cold placement at times. Under stress, a south node Capricorn. Coming through the family. So we say authority, we say difficulties with the family. But we know it's trauma, we know it involves a physical aspect. Physical abuse rises as a question here. persecutory messages where people treat this person as if she were worthless.
Are you saying there's something between the son and the father?
Am I saying what, sorry?
That there was some abuse by the father towards the individual as the son?
Well, I mean, okay, so the question of abuse has been raised here, or I've raised it and you're picking up on it. I mean, Uranus trauma, Saturn physical, the authority issue, the South Node in Capricorn, on the 10th house, on the midheaven, yeah, the father, the actual father being physically abusive. Is this person's actual father, was this person's actual father physically abusive? Yes. Yes, this person's actual father was physically abusive. Whilst they were a child, Uranus 5th. Whilst they were trying to develop that creative sense of self-actualization that would go out into the world. They left home because the father beat them so badly that when the nurse peeled back the wounds, she wept and left the room, and the doctor told her she must leave home, otherwise her life was at risk, as she'd been beaten with a dog chain. That's the extremity of it. And it's not, I mean, one says these things and EA can get, and we can get in when looking at trauma, it's the glamorization of these things. It was a horrible event. Strangely, this lady did not just hate her father. It's not as simple as that. The complexity of the abuse in this family was very, very severe, and it involved siblings, the drawing in of the sun Gemini. Very damaged boys in the family who turned to her as a solace, but used her physically and sexually as part of that, or tried to. There was a lot of, this is a very strong-willed person. It's not an easy example, this, because, but I include it because when we see at the center of the chart trauma signatures like this, we don't want to be afraid of seeing what might have happened, because it rings true with the client's reality. It's not an imposition. If anything, when I looked at this chart, I had milder visions of what might have happened than she was actually telling me. Yes.
Is the mother out of the picture?
Yes.
Unavailable because
Yes.
of the moon in the 12th house?
Exactly. Moon in the 12th house, and it's a skip step. The mother's fundamentally unavailable. She doesn't even realize half of this stuff is going on. Unbelievable. And actually, the mother's unavailability in the present kind of time is more hurtful to this person than the father, who she did realize at a later date did love her, and there was some degree of peacemaking. The sad thing was the pattern of attracting certain types of men. And the present man, who was a serial, who had some sadomasochistic problems, I'll put it like that, because there's a sadness here in that when I did this reading or met this person, there was a real sense of what we were talking about being a light for her, a light at the end of the tunnel, she said, a session just before Christmas. And we liberated a long-term pattern in her self-worth that had been caused by knowing this person and their lies. Unfortunately, at a period later, when meeting again, I had to just watch this person sink back into that other's lies. I mean, you know, I said things, don't get me wrong. I'm not going to go into it totally. We're only doing this as a brief example. And I know it's not very nice when you hear these kinds of stories, and there was some sexual abuse stories, someone in extended family and stuff like that. But I'm doing it because I'm just wanting to create supportive evidence for this type of signature. Yes?
There's some illusion going on with that Neptune in the 8th house in
Yes.
Scorpio. House of the soulmate.
It's more than just illusion, really, in a sense. When we see Neptune, when we see a chart that's already trauma signatured, and we see Neptune in Scorpio like that, you're looking at the potential for real use and abuse with others. Profound disillusionment through abuse and betrayal. I mean, to give you a flavor, in the first time I met this lady, her boyfriend had prepared a handout for me on her problems. An 8-page handout to help me help her. Now that's a first, folks. That really is. My reaction, as you can imagine, was intensely disdainful. I did actually agree to read it, but I mean, only to illustrate to her what was going on. Later, we would read in less happy times the letters from this person's wife and how the impassioned "you destroyed my life" letter. And we named how she echoed the same sentiment, you know, to some extent. But you can't make choices for people. I wish her the very best. At some point, the resource question that someone named, the struggle with resources and in herself, became so detrimental, and his financial hand and temptation constantly in offering this certain vision of a life for her became too much for her to resist. But it's very sad because it's an aspect of the shame and the internal, the way she's been made to feel about herself. When he was trying to get back with her after I'd helped her separate, in a sense, or helped her realize that that might be just to step back, not to leave, but to step back, he lived somewhere else. He invited her out the other country where he lived, and literally on the drive from the airport drove her to view an apartment that he might be thinking of buying, and there's a room for her to do her thing, and he never got that apartment, but it was all part of the, yeah. Yes?
What about the North Node conjunct the midheaven, and is that a quincunx moon to
It's the
Uranus?
South Node.
I mean South Node. Is that a quincunx between the moon and Uranus? The green line?
Yes, it is. It's a trauma signature. So actually, the skip step is an overt trauma signature through that. You see, the South Node is all about the accumulated guilt through the family and the restriction. It's also, because it's really in the ninth, there's a progressive guilt built up inside her and shame because she knows better. She knows. There's also a slavery signature. On a past life level, I mean, I didn't do past life work with this person, but if you wanted to analyze this chart on a past life level, this is a slavery signature. Moon in the 12th is a skip step, the inconjunct Uranus, the trauma signature, applying to the guilt, the restriction of freedom, the South Node Capricorn in the 9th.
What about when a chart is so difficult, the evolutionary level, you know, the state, the evolutionary state?
Yeah, this person's in that early individuated condition, and they're just like a really lovely person. They're stunningly youthful looking, stunningly, like they look, like they made me feel old, and they were kind of a bit older than me, you know. Really nice person, principled, wouldn't hurt anyone, but the internal shame and the stream of this past. Yeah, I wish her well. I really do sincerely wish her well. She was is a lovely lady. Okay, so 20 minutes. I'm going to introduce a chart that I want us to carry on over with tomorrow. To have more distance, okay, cool. So, I mean, when we shift from Uranus in Leo or the 5th house to Uranus in Virgo or the 6th house, we're talking about a shift from trauma around the superhuman complex or the fantasy or need for acceptance or special regard or the creative destiny to a trauma around alienation from the immediate environment, internal persecutory voices and messages, internalized guilt. Brief aside on internalized guilt. In evolutionary astrology, or at least one of the ways Jeffrey taught this, was that in Capricorn and Saturn you have an issue of what you might call authentic guilt. Something you did wrong that you want to own and take responsibility for at best. Genuine guilt. With Virgo you have a situation of internal guilt, introjected guilt. He called it injected guilt, because it's literally like it's being drip-fed into your system. It may have no causal link to anything you specifically did. It has a relationship to certain messages culturally, including in the age of Pisces, the sub-age of Virgo, around 1200 AD was the rise of the cathedral culture, the rise of the church intellectually, the idea of original sin. But it explicitly corresponds to a problem whereby messages in an environment, so say routinely a child goes into an environment and finds that people are disinterested or lack care. The child over a period of time starts to internalize they are uninteresting, they are not worth caring about. That is injected guilt. The child didn't crap on the carpet, hurt their sister, do anything terrible, but the feedback loop feeds back to them that that's the way they are. That is the nature of interjected. Interject is a psychologist term for a message you took, was originally given to you from outside, but now you're recreating it inside. Interjected guilt. And the really crushing thing is, the kind of guilt that has no specific cause can be the worst kind of guilt, because in genuine guilt, you can own it, apologize, and take responsibility. But these people in a whole cycle of spiraling self-analysis hunt for that place, that thing that happened, that thing that they did, and they can't necessarily find it. And then it's a struggle to take responsibility. It's a struggle to deal with it. That's the real problem with it. The guilt created from the thing that you didn't do can be worse than the guilt for the stuff you did do. It all depends how it plays out. The specific nature of the Virgo problem, in that sense, is to do with mental scripts. The inner self-voice that's running. I'm really good on all the traumatic problems of the Virgo generation. I'm a last degree Pluto Virgo. I tried to write a book called The Pluto and Virgo Generation a couple of years ago, and quite genuinely now, I wrote about 60,000 words, and then I had a Pluto and Virgo crisis about how it was all fitting together, and I stopped writing. Yeah. I know. I must confess to not having entirely dealt with these issues. On one hand, there can be a perfect standard of ideal. On the other hand, there can be this constant search to need to know why, what's the cause. A why that may not have an end point. And then it becomes a source that's circling an inner lack. It can be an inner voidness or an inner lack. When the Virgo trauma signature has gone too far and inverted the Leo principle too far, then it can create the opposite of the Leo overshining. It can become like the black hole, the other side of the sun, if you like. Now, why don't we take down the details of this chart? And it's March 19th, 1964, 4:55 a.m. Whiston, W-H-I-S-T-O-N, England. Now, I'm not suggesting homework, not in a world of the schedule of this conference, but if you think about this chart, or when we come back tomorrow, when we put it up maybe a little bit before we start, I'd like us to try and approach it together, to look at how it might work. We've talked about the depth signature, you rate the trauma signature in Virgo, and then we can pick up tomorrow with also what it means in the 7th house. But we've got a lot to go on just with the trauma signature as it applies through Virgo, and remember this happened to a whole sort of mini generation of people in the 60s. Yes, Mercury squares the node, as Sawyer's saying, and it's the ruler of the Pluto-Uranus, but it also, because the south node in Capricorn is in the 11th house, the skipped step and the entire nodal axis is a trauma signature. This is another one of those charts where there's ways of looking at it, where the whole thing just plays through the trauma. And again, and I'm not making this up, that bears out in the person's reality. It is not a false imposition. It has been helpful to this person, and this person is proud to be an example in that sense. But when you see almost the entire chart drawn into a trauma signature, there is something to be followed. It is serious, it is real, it is worth following. And it's worth it for them as much as our insight and understanding. Now everyone's tired now, and I think we can call it a day fairly soon. But let's just soak up that chart and have a little think about it. And we're going to come back tomorrow and look at Pluto in Libra. And we're going to try and read this chart together in depth. Now I'll take some questions.
Can you just address the intercepted chart thing, intercepted houses a little bit? If you want. If you want.
I don't... I mean, I rope Kim in or something here. I mean, Jeff taught on intercepted houses, and I was never that clear on it myself. Yes, please. Thanks, Kim. We might as well get it straight. Thanks.
When you have signs intercepted, is this was a previous example, isn't it? Oh, Taurus. Okay, so I can literally teach this one. When you have signs intercepted, I'll use this. Oh.
Cheers.
When you have signs intercepted, traditional astrology will always say that that intercepted sign cannot get out and it can't be expressed, and you have to learn how to express it. The evolutionary astrology observation correlation is that when you have intercepted signs, it can be an either-or situation. That may be true, but it's also quite possible that that intercepted sign was overly developed in a previous life, and it does not need a house cusp to be expressed in the current life. And one of the ways that you play astrological detective and figure that out is you look at the signs that are intercepted, you look at their planetary rulers, and then you look to see how active those planetary rulers are in that chart, and that will let you figure it out. So if we look at this example, and I'll try and get out of the way, if you look at this example, you see Scorpio and Taurus intercepted, so you will look at the number of aspects to those planets, and you can already just kind of tell because you have that Pluto-Virgo conjunction. Pluto rules Scorpio. That right there tells you a sense of activity. You start to look at Venus, and it's square the horizontal axes. You see that Pluto in the 7th house. You see Saturn in Libra. You start to see that Venus emphasis.
Saturn Aquarius.
I'm sorry, Saturn Aquarius. But you can say Saturn first house opposite that 7th house. Let me see. It's within orb of the opposition to Uranus. By default, maybe Pluto too. You start to see that Pluto and Venus have activity in this chart. Make sense?
Yeah.
So again, just to repeat.
So when it has activity, that means those archetypes are especially difficult or unresolved, or
it does it. Well, by the aspects will tell you what degree of activity and what needs to be resolved. The phasal relationships.
Because I mean, certainly in this person's chart, the Taurus Scorpio archetype is, I mean, as we're going to see when we look at this chart, the whole idea of how you take care of yourself as a person and whether that's even possible for this person is a major question. Whether you can relate to your own needs, Taurus, 2nd house, whether you can relate to your unconditioned self in any way is going to be a major question. It's going to be a major area of activity. And the platonic dependence on others and certain ways that plays out We're tired, folks. I'll take any questions on the general principle. We'll come back to this chart tomorrow, and we'll try and frame it as a larger example and really look at structurally how it works. I'll take any... we can close this down. I'll just take some questions informally if you want, if anyone's got any for a few minutes about what we've spoken about. So